When Marcus walked out on me 5 years ago, claiming he wasn't ready to be a father and needed his freedom, I thought my world had ended. I was 3 months pregnant, alone, and watching the man I loved choose his bachelor lifestyle over our unborn child. He said I'd be fine on my own, that maybe this wasn't meant to be. What he didn't know was that his abandonment would forge me into someone stronger than he ever imagined, and that one day, karma would come knocking in the form of legal documents he never saw coming. If this story resonates with you, hit subscribe and let me know your city in the comments below. The pregnancy test trembled in my hands as 2 pink lines appeared, clear as day, changing everything in an instant. I stared at those lines for what felt like hours, my heart racing between excitement and terror. Marcus and I had been together for 2 years, living in a small apartment downtown, talking about our future in the abstract way young couples do when forever seems both inevitable and impossibly distant. I found him in our kitchen, making his usual morning coffee, humming some tune from the radio while sunlight streamed through our tiny window. He looked so content, so unaware that our entire universe was about to shift on its axis. For a moment, I just watched him. This man I loved, this person I'd built my dreams around, and tried to memorize this last moment of our old life before everything changed. "Marcus," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned, and I saw his face register the seriousness in my expression, the way I was clutching something in my hands like it held the secrets of the universe. "We need to talk." He set down his coffee mug, the ceramic making a soft clink against the granite countertop we'd saved months to afford. "What's wrong, Isabella? You look like you've seen a ghost." His voice carried that gentle concern that had first made me fall in love with him, back when he seemed like the kind of man who would face any challenge head-on. I held out the pregnancy test, my hand shaking despite my efforts to appear calm. "I'm pregnant, Marcus. We're going to have a baby." The silence that followed felt infinite. I watched his face transform through a series of emotions: surprise, confusion, something that might have been panic, and finally, a kind of resignation that made my stomach drop even before he spoke. He took the test from my hands, staring at it as if he could will those pink lines to disappear through sheer force of desire. "Are you sure?" he asked, though the evidence was literally in his hands. "Maybe it's a false positive. Those happen, right? Maybe we should get another test, or see a doctor, or—" "I took 3 tests, Marcus. They're all positive." I sat down heavily in one of our mismatched kitchen chairs, suddenly feeling exhausted despite the early hour. "I have an appointment with Dr. Martinez next week to confirm everything, but there's no doubt. We're going to be parents." He set the test down on the counter like it might explode, then ran his hands through his dark hair, and the gesture I'd learned meant he was overwhelmed. "Isabella, this is a lot to process. We never really talked about this seriously. We're not ready for this. I'm not ready for this. People are never really ready," I said, trying to inject optimism into my voice even as fear began creeping up my spine. "But we love each other. We can figure this out together. Lots of couples start families without having everything perfectly planned." Marcus shook his head, backing away from the counter as if physical distance could somehow solve the situation. "No, Isabella, you don't understand. I have plans, career goals. I'm supposed to get promoted next month, and then there's the possibility of that transfer to the Seattle office. I can't be tied down with a baby right now. This changes everything." The words "tied down" hit me like a physical blow. I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest as I realized that what I saw as the beginning of our family, he saw as the end of his freedom. "Tied down? Is that what you think a baby would be? What I would be? That's not what I meant." But his voice lacked conviction, and we both knew it was exactly what he meant. "It's just timing, Isabella. The timing is all wrong. Maybe in a few years, when I'm more established, when we have more money saved up, when we're actually married." "But it's, when we're married," I repeated, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "Marcus, we've been living together for over a year. We talk about our future like it's a given. I thought we were building something together." He began pacing our small kitchen, his movements agitated and restless. "We are, but a baby. That's permanent, Isabella. That's 18 years of responsibility, of putting someone else's needs first, of not being able to just pick up and move when opportunities arise. I'm 28 years old. I'm not ready to give up my life yet." "Give up your life?" The phrase came out strangled, barely audible. "What about my life, Marcus? What about what I want?" He stopped pacing and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. a mixture of pity and exasperation that made me feel small and foolish. "You've always talked about wanting kids someday. This is probably exciting for you, but I never signed up for this. Not now. Not like this." The kitchen fell silent, except for the hum of our old refrigerator and the distant sounds of traffic from the street below. I stared at this man I thought I knew, wondering when he'd become someone who could speak about our unborn child like an inconvenient business merger, someone who could look at my excitement and dismiss it as naive foolishness. "So what are you saying exactly?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer, and was desperately hoping I was wrong. Marcus sat down across from me, his expression carefully composed in the way that meant he'd already made his decision, and was now just managing the aftermath. "I think maybe this is a sign that we want different things, that we're at different places in our lives. Maybe we should take some time apart, let you figure out what you want to do about this situation." "This situation?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. "You mean our baby?" "Isabella, please don't make this harder than it has to be." His tone had shifted to something patronizing, as if I were being unreasonably emotional about a perfectly logical decision. "You're smart, you're capable, you have a good job. You'll be fine whatever you decide, but I can't pretend to be ready for something I'm not. It wouldn't be fair to any of us." The devastating clarity of that moment will stay with me forever. He wasn't asking for time to process or discuss options or figure out how to make things work. He was leaving. He was walking away from me, from our baby, from everything we'd built together, because the reality of fatherhood didn't fit into his perfectly planned trajectory. "You're abandoning us," I said, the words carrying all the weight of betrayal and disbelief that was crushing my chest. "You're actually going to walk away from your own child." Marcus flinched at the word abandoning, but his resolve didn't waver. "I'm being honest about what I can and can't handle right now. Isn't that better than staying and resenting the situation? Better than being a father who doesn't want to be there?" "Better for who?" I asked. But he was already standing up, already moving toward the door, already gone in every way that mattered. Within a week, Marcus had moved out of our apartment, taking his clothes, his books, his coffee maker, and apparently all traces of the man I'd fallen in love with. He left behind a check for half of that month's rent, and a note saying he hoped I'd make the right decision for everyone involved. The right decision. As if there was a choice that wouldn't fundamentally alter the course of my entire life. As if any option available to me wouldn't require sacrifice and struggle and a complete reimagining of my future. As if his definition of right had any relevance to a situation he was choosing to walk away from. I kept that note for years, not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder of how someone could reduce the most consequential moment of your life to a casual suggestion, how they could abandon their responsibilities while still maintaining the arrogance to offer advice about how you should handle the mess they left behind. The first few months after Marcus left were the loneliest of my life. I'd wake up each morning in our apartment, now just my apartment, and for a split second forget that everything had changed. I'd reach for the other side of the bed, or start making coffee for two before reality crashed back down on me. The pregnancy symptoms didn't care about my emotional state. Morning sickness arrived right on schedule, making my daily commute to my job at the marketing firm a miserable endurance test. Doctor. Martinez confirmed what the pregnancy test had already told me, and suddenly the abstract concept of having a baby became a series of concrete medical appointments, vitamin prescriptions, and lifestyle changes that made Marcus's absence feel even more profound. Every decision, from choosing a birthing class to deciding whether to find out the baby's gender, highlighted the fact that I was navigating this monumental experience completely alone. My coworkers noticed the changes before I was ready to explain them. Sarah, who sat in the cubicle next to mine, finally asked directly if I was feeling all right after I'd rushed to the bathroom for the third time during a morning meeting. I found myself telling her everything, about Marcus, about the pregnancy, about the overwhelming sense of being abandoned right when I needed support most. "What a complete asshole," Sarah said with the fierce loyalty of someone who'd become a good friend, despite our professional setting. "I mean, I know you loved him, but honestly, Isabella, you're better off without someone who would bail the moment things got real." I wanted to believe her, but sitting in that office bathroom, trying not to cry while dealing with another wave of morning sickness, it was hard to feel like anything about my situation qualified as better off. I was 29 years old, starting over completely, facing single motherhood without any of the support systems that made such challenges manageable. The financial reality hit me hardest during my second trimester. when I started researching childcare costs and pediatric health insurance and all the mundane expenses that came with bringing a human being into the world. My salary at the marketing firm was decent for a single person living in a one-bedroom apartment, but it wasn't designed to support a family, especially when that family would soon include someone who couldn't contribute to the household income for at least 18 years. I applied for a promotion that would have provided better benefits and higher pay, but lost out to a colleague who didn't have the complication of impending maternity leave. My supervisor was careful to never state this directly, but the message was clear. Pregnant women were seen as risky investments, people whose priorities might shift away from professional advancement toward personal responsibilities. The apartment that had felt cozy for 2 people suddenly seemed inadequate for a mother and baby. The second bedroom was barely large enough for a desk and filing cabinet, let alone a crib and changing table and all the equipment that apparently came with infant care. But moving required deposits and higher rent, and the kind of financial flexibility that disappeared the moment I became solely responsible for preparing for a child's arrival. I spent evenings researching everything I could about pregnancy, childbirth, and newborn care, trying to educate myself enough to compensate for the absence of a partner who could share the responsibility of making sure we were prepared. The internet was full of advice aimed at couples, filled with phrases like, "you and your partner," and "make sure dad is involved," constant reminders that I was doing this alone. The baby started moving during my 20th week, little flutters that gradually became distinct kicks and rolls. The first time I felt that movement, I instinctively reached for my phone to call Marcus, to share this incredible moment with the person who should have been experiencing it alongside me. Instead, I sat alone in my living room, one hand on my growing belly, crying for all the shared moments he was choosing to miss. I tried to convince myself that his absence was actually a blessing, that I was better off without someone who could abandon his own child so easily. But the truth was messier and more painful than that simple narrative. I missed him. I missed having someone to talk to about my fears and excitement, someone to help make decisions, someone to reassure me when pregnancy symptoms scared me, or when the magnitude of what I was facing felt overwhelming. My parents had passed away several years earlier in a car accident, and I had no siblings, no close family members who could step in to provide the support that Marcus's departure had eliminated. I had friends, but most of them were childless and focused on their own careers and relationships. They were sympathetic and kind, but none of them could truly understand what I was going through or provide the practical help I desperately needed. At 7 months pregnant, I finally worked up the courage to reach out to Marcus directly. I'd been thinking about practical matters, health insurance that covered the baby, emergency contacts for medical situations, the legal complexity of having a child with someone who'd essentially disappeared from my life. I also, if I'm being honest, harbored some hope that time had given him perspective, that he might have realized what he was walking away from. I called his number on a Thursday evening, my hands shaking as I listened to the phone ring. When he answered, his voice was careful, distant, like I was a former colleague he barely remembered, rather than someone who was carrying his child. "Isabella," he said, and I could hear noise in the background. Music, laughter, the sounds of other people having fun. "This is unexpected. Is everything okay?" "I'm fine. The baby's fine." I got straight to the point, not wanting to prolong what was already an uncomfortable conversation. I just needed to discuss some practical things. Medical decisions, emergency contacts, that sort of thing. Medical decisions? He sounded genuinely confused, as if the idea that he might have any role in decisions about his own child had never occurred to him. "Marcus, this is your baby too, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. What if something happens during delivery? What if there are complications? I need to know if you want to be contacted, if you want any say in medical decisions." There was a long pause, and I could hear him moving to somewhere quieter. When he spoke again, his voice was even more distant than before. "Isabella, I thought I made my position clear. I'm not ready to be a father. I can't be involved in this. It's better for everyone if you just handle things on your own." "Handle things on my own?" I repeated, incredulous. "Marcus, this isn't a work project I can just manage independently. This is your child, your son or daughter." "I know what it is," he said, and for the first time I heard something like defensiveness in his voice. "But I also know what I can and can't handle. I'm not going to pretend to be ready for something I'm not. That wouldn't be fair to anyone." The conversation ended much like our relationship had, with Marcus explaining why his limitations were actually considerate, why his inability to step up was somehow the most responsible choice available to him. I hung up feeling more alone than ever, but also with a growing sense of anger that would sustain me through the final months of pregnancy and beyond. My daughter Elena was born on a snowy February morning after 14 hours of labor that I endured with only a nurse and a doula for support. She was perfect. 7 pounds, 2 ounces of possibility and promise, with dark hair like her father's and my stubborn chin. Holding her for the first time, I felt a completeness I hadn't expected, as if some part of me that had been missing had finally clicked into place. The birth certificate required a father's name, and I stared at the blank line for a long time before writing Marcus Daniel Rivera in careful block letters. Whatever his choices, Elena deserved to know who her father was, deserved to have her parentage officially documented, even if he couldn't be bothered to show up for her arrival. Those early months with Elena were simultaneously the most challenging and most rewarding of my life. Sleep became a luxury measured in 2-hour increments. My body ached constantly as it recovered from childbirth while adapting to the physical demands of caring for a newborn. Every decision felt momentous. Was she eating enough? Sleeping enough? Developing properly? The weight of being solely responsible for another human being's well-being was overwhelming in ways I couldn't have anticipated. But Elena was also joy incarnate. Her first smile, her first laugh, the way she'd calm down when I sang to her. These moments made every sleepless night and worried decision worthwhile. I understood in a way I never had before, how people could reorganize their entire lives around loving someone this completely. I took the maximum maternity leave my job allowed, but returning to work when Elena was 12 weeks old felt like tearing my heart out. Daycare costs consumed nearly half my salary, but I had no choice. Single mothers don't have the luxury of extended time off or reduced schedules that might better accommodate their children's needs. The daycare I found was clean and well run, but leaving Elena there every morning required a level of trust I wasn't sure I was ready for. She was so small, so dependent, and I was entrusting her care to people who, however professional and caring, would never love her the way I did. The guilt was overwhelming. Guilt about working, guilt about not being able to provide better care, guilt about the moments I missed while earning the money that made her care possible. Marcus, meanwhile, had apparently achieved the professional success he'd prioritized over fatherhood. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned that he'd received the promotion he'd been hoping for, and had indeed transferred to the Seattle office. His social media showed a life of professional accomplishments and social events, travel and restaurants, and all the freedoms he'd felt my pregnancy would eliminate. I stopped looking at his posts after Elena's first birthday, when I realized that seeing evidence of his happiness while I struggled with single parenthood was poisoning my ability to focus on building a good life for my daughter and myself. He'd made his choice, and torturing myself with reminders of what he'd chosen over us served no constructive purpose. Elena grew into a bright, curious toddler who filled our small apartment with laughter and energy. She was walking by 10 months, talking in complete sentences before her second birthday, and displayed a stubborn independence that reminded me daily of both her parents' genetic contributions. She never asked about her father during those early years, accepting our family structure as simply the way things were. I advanced in my career, eventually securing the promotion I'd been denied while pregnant. The increased salary allowed us to move into a better apartment in a neighborhood with good schools and safe playgrounds. I learned to navigate parent-teacher conferences and playground politics, birthday parties and sleepover logistics, all the social structures built around the assumption that children have 2 involved parents. By Elena's 3rd birthday, I'd built a life that worked for us. We had routines and traditions, friends and activities, a community that had grown around our small family of 2. I'd even started dating occasionally, though finding someone willing to embrace both me and my daughter proved more challenging than I'd expected. Elena was my priority, and anyone who couldn't understand that wasn't someone I wanted in our lives. It was around this time that I started thinking seriously about legal matters I'd been avoiding since Elena's birth. Marcus's name was on her birth certificate, but he'd never had any legal contact with her, never paid child support, never acknowledged her existence in any official capacity. I consulted with a family lawyer about formalizing this arrangement, about protecting Elena and myself from any future claims or complications. "Has he ever expressed interest in custody or visitation?" the lawyer asked, reviewing the minimal documentation I could provide about Marcus's involvement in Elena's life. "No," I said. "He's made it very clear that he wants nothing to do with us. But I worry about what happens if that changes, if he decides someday that he wants rights without having fulfilled any responsibilities." The lawyer nodded knowingly. "Unfortunately, Biological fathers retain certain legal rights even when they've been completely absent. But there are ways to protect yourself and your daughter. We could file for sole legal and physical custody, establish a formal child support order, create documentation that establishes the pattern of abandonment. I left that meeting with paperwork to consider and decisions to make. Part of me wanted to let sleeping dogs lie, to avoid any legal action that might draw Marcus's attention back to us. But a larger part of me, the part that had spent 4 years building a life while he pursued his freedom, wanted protection for the family we'd become without his help or input. It was Elena's 4th birthday that changed everything. I'd planned a small party at a local children's museum, inviting her friends from preschool and their parents. Elena was excited for weeks beforehand, helping me choose decorations and plan activities, chattering endlessly about her birthday wishes and the cake she wanted me to make. The party was perfect in the way that children's parties can be, chaotic and joyful, filled with laughter and sugar-fueled energy. Elena wore a princess dress that made her feel beautiful and special, and her friends brought gifts that would be forgotten within days but mattered enormously in the moment. Watching her blow out her candles, surrounded by people who loved her, I felt proud of what we'd built together. It was 2 days later that my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, expecting a telemarketer or wrong number, I heard a voice that made my blood freeze. "Isabella, it's Marcus." The sound of his name and his own voice transported me instantly back to that morning in our kitchen, when my world had shifted on its axis. 4 years of building a life, of healing from his abandonment, of teaching myself that Elena and I were complete without him. All of it felt suddenly fragile in the face of his unexpected contact. "Marcus," I said, my voice carefully neutral even as my heart began racing. "This is surprising." "I know it's been a while," he said, and I could hear nervousness in his voice that was completely at odds with the confident dismissal I remembered from our last conversation. "I've been thinking about things lately. About Elena, about what I've missed. Elena." Hearing him say her name felt like a violation somehow, as if he'd lost the right to claim familiarity with someone he'd never met. She was 4 years old, walking and talking and developing her own personality, and he knew none of it because he'd chosen not to. "What do you want, Marcus?" I asked, not interested in pleasantries or explanations that couldn't possibly justify 4 years of absence. "I want to meet her," he said, the words rushing out as if he'd been practicing them. "I know I made mistakes, Isabella. I know I wasn't ready before, but I've grown up a lot, and I've been thinking about what kind of man I want to be, what kind of father I could be if given the chance." The audacity was breathtaking. 4 years of silence, of providing no support, financial or emotional, and now he wanted to walk back into our lives because he'd decided he was ready to be a father? Because his timeline had finally aligned with the reality of Elena's existence? "Marcus, you don't get to disappear for 4 years and then decide you want to be a father when it's convenient for you," I said, my voice shaking with controlled anger. "Elena doesn't even know you exist. You're a stranger to her." "I know that," he said, and I could hear what sounded like genuine regret in his voice. "I know I have a lot to make up for. But she's my daughter too, Isabella. I have rights. Rights." The word hung between us like a challenge, carrying implications that made my chest tighten with anxiety. He had rights. Legal rights that his abandonment hadn't eliminated. Rights that could complicate the life Elena and I had built together. Rights that could force us to accommodate someone who'd proven he couldn't be counted on when things got difficult. "Your rights?" I repeated, incredulous. "What about your responsibilities, Marcus? What about 4 years of no contact, no support, no interest in her well-being? What about the fact that you told me to handle things on my own and now expect me to welcome you into a life you chose to abandon?" "I know I made mistakes," he said again, and I could hear frustration creeping into his voice. "But people change, Isabella. I'm in a better place now, financially and emotionally. I could provide for her, be the father she deserves." "The father she deserves?" My voice rose despite my efforts to stay calm. "Marcus, she's needed a father every day for 4 years. When she was sick with ear infections and I spent nights in emergency rooms alone. When she took her first steps and said her first words and started preschool. When she asked why some kids have daddies and others don't. Where was the father she deserved then?" The silence stretched between us, filled with all the moments he'd missed and all the struggles I'd faced alone. When he spoke again, his voice was harder, more determined. "I can't change the past, Isabella, but I can be part of her future. And if you won't let me do that voluntarily, I'll have to explore other options." The threat was implicit but clear. He was prepared to take legal action to force contact with Elena, to use the rights he'd never exercised to disrupt the life we'd built without him. The conversation ended with promises to think about things and be in touch soon, but I knew this wasn't a request anymore. It was the beginning of a battle I hadn't chosen but would have to fight. That night, after Elena was asleep, I sat in our living room surrounded by the evidence of the life we'd built together. Her artwork on the refrigerator, toys scattered across the floor, photos documenting every milestone he'd missed, and tried to process the implications of Marcus's sudden reappearance. He had rights. Legal rights that could force visitation, that could require me to hand over my 4-year-old daughter to a man she'd never met, that could disrupt our routines and security based on nothing more than his belated decision that fatherhood might be interesting after all. But I had something too, something I'd been building for 4 years without realizing its ultimate value. I had documentation, records of every doctor's appointment I'd attended alone, every emergency room visit, every milestone celebration. I had 4 years of bank statements showing no child support, no financial contribution of any kind. I had witnesses, daycare providers, teachers, friends, who could testify to Elena's well-being under my sole care and to Marcus's complete absence from her life. Most importantly, I had Elena herself, a happy, healthy, well-adjusted child who'd never needed to wonder whether her father would show up, because he simply wasn't part of her reality. A little girl who'd grown up secure in the knowledge that she was loved and wanted and prioritized by the parent who'd chosen to stay. The next morning, I called the family lawyer I'd consulted years earlier. It was time to stop worrying about what Marcus might do and start taking action to protect what Elena and I had built together. If he wanted to exercise his rights as a father, he could explain to a judge why he'd waited 4 years to remember he had a daughter. "I need to file for sole custody," I told the lawyer when I reached her office. "And I need to do it before he files for visitation or partial custody." She reviewed my documentation with the thoroughness I remembered from our previous consultation, asking detailed questions about Marcus's involvement, or lack thereof, in Elena's life. The picture that emerged was clear: a biological father who'd completely abandoned his child, and a mother who'd stepped up to provide everything Elena needed. "This is actually a stronger case than most," the lawyer said, organizing the papers on her desk. "Complete abandonment for 4 years, no financial support, no contact. The courts generally look favorably on parents who've been doing the work versus those who show up with belated interest." "But he does have rights, doesn't he?" I asked, voicing the fear that had been keeping me awake at night. "Biological fathers do have rights," she confirmed, "but those rights exist within the context of the child's best interests. A judge is going to ask what's best for Elena, not what's convenient for Marcus." We filed the custody petition that afternoon, officially requesting sole legal and physical custody of Elena, along with a formal child support order for the 4 years of unpaid support. The paperwork detailed Marcus's abandonment, my sole responsibility for Elena's care, and my request that any visitation be contingent on his willingness to undergo counseling and gradual introduction processes that prioritized Elena's emotional well-being. The court date was set for 6 weeks later, giving Marcus time to respond and potentially file counter-motions. I spent those weeks documenting everything: Elena's routines, her relationships with the people in our lives, evidence of her happiness and stability. I prepared character witnesses and gathered documentation that would demonstrate both my fitness as a parent and Marcus's unfitness as someone seeking rights without having fulfilled responsibilities. Marcus's response, when it came, was predictably self-serving. His lawyer filed a motion requesting joint custody and claiming that his absence had been due to emotional immaturity rather than abandonment, that he'd always intended to be part of Elena's life once he was better prepared to handle the responsibilities of fatherhood. Reading his motion felt like reliving our original breakup, the same deflection of responsibility, the same reframing of his choices as somehow thoughtful rather than selfish. He claimed that I'd been hostile to his involvement, that his absence was partly due to my unwillingness to accommodate his need for time to adjust to fatherhood. The lies were breathtaking in their audacity, but I knew that's what they were: lies. I had documentation of our conversations, including his explicit statement that he wanted nothing to do with us. I had witnesses who could testify to my attempts to include him in medical decisions and my willingness to maintain contact if he'd shown any interest in Elena's well-being. The day of the custody hearing arrived gray and rainy, matching my mood as I prepared to face Marcus in court for the first time since Elena's birth. I'd arranged for childcare, not wanting Elena to witness proceedings that would determine her future, but that she was too young to understand. Marcus arrived with his lawyer, looking professional and confident in a way that made my stomach clench with anxiety. He'd gained some weight over the years, looked more mature and settled than the young man who'd panicked at the thought of fatherhood. Seeing him again brought back memories I'd worked hard to move past, reminders of how much I'd once loved someone who'd proven himself unworthy of that love, but I wasn't the same person either. 4 years of single motherhood had changed me, given me strength I hadn't known I possessed, and clarity about what really mattered. I was no longer the pregnant woman begging him to stay. I was Elena's mother, fighting to protect the life we'd built together. The proceedings began with Marcus's lawyer presenting their case for joint custody, arguing that their client's initial absence was due to immaturity rather than abandonment, that he'd since become stable and financially successful, that Elena deserved the opportunity to know her father. Everything they said was technically true, but fundamentally misleading. Marcus had become successful, using the freedom from parental responsibilities that abandoning us had provided. He was financially stable, because he'd never paid child support or contributed to Elena's expenses. He claimed to want a relationship with Elena, now that the hard work of raising her through infancy and toddlerhood was complete. When my lawyer presented our case, the contrast was stark. 4 years of documented sole responsibility, medical records showing my attendance at every appointment, school records establishing Elena's stability and happiness, financial records proving that I'd provided everything she needed, without any contribution from Marcus. "Your Honor," my lawyer said during her closing argument, "Ms. Isabella Chen has been Elena's only parent since birth. She's provided everything this child has needed, financially, emotionally, medically, while Mr. Rivera has provided nothing. His sudden interest in fatherhood doesn't erase 4 years of abandonment, nor does it establish his fitness to share custody of a child he's never even met." The judge, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes but a no-nonsense demeanor, asked pointed questions about Marcus's absence and his claims about wanting to be involved. His answers were evasive and self-serving, full of excuses about emotional readiness and financial stability that couldn't explain why he'd never sent a birthday card or asked about Elena's well-being. When the judge asked me about my willingness to facilitate a relationship between Marcus and Elena, I answered honestly, "Your Honor, I've always been willing to include Elena's father in her life, if he'd shown genuine interest in her well-being, rather than just his own rights. But she doesn't know him. He's a stranger to her, and any contact would need to be gradual and focused on her needs rather than his convenience." The judge recessed for 30 minutes to review the evidence and consider her decision. I sat in the courthouse hallway, checking my phone for updates from Elena's babysitter and trying to calm my racing heart. Everything Elena and I had built together was hanging in the balance, dependent on a stranger's interpretation of what was best for a child she'd never met. When court reconvened, the judge's expression was unreadable as she prepared to deliver her decision. The silence in the courtroom felt infinite, as she reviewed her notes one final time before speaking. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that would change people's lives forever. "This court finds that the best interests of the minor child, Elena Rivera Chen, are served by awarding sole legal and physical custody to the mother, Isabella Chen." Relief flooded through me so completely that I had to grip the table to keep from collapsing. Sole custody. Elena would remain with me, safe from the disruption of forced visitation with a father who'd proven himself unreliable when reliability mattered most. But the judge wasn't finished. "However," she continued, and my relief turned to ice in my veins, "this court also recognizes that children benefit from relationships with both parents when those relationships serve their best interests. Therefore, Mr. Rivera will be granted supervised visitation, beginning with 1 hour per week and increasing gradually based on Elena's adjustment and his demonstrated commitment to her well-being. Supervised visitation. It wasn't the complete protection I'd hoped for, but it was something. Marcus would have to prove himself worthy of Elena's time and attention, would have to demonstrate that his interest in fatherhood extended beyond the novelty of claiming paternal rights. The judge also ordered Marcus to pay child support, not just going forward, but retroactively for the 4 years he'd been absent. The amount was substantial, calculated based on his current income, and designed to compensate for the financial burden I'd shouldered alone since Elena's birth. As we left the courthouse, Marcus's lawyer approached mine with a proposal. Instead of beginning the supervised visitation immediately, they suggested a settlement. Marcus would waive all custody and visitation rights in exchange for my agreement not to pursue the retroactive child support order. I stared at this man, who'd claimed to want a relationship with his daughter, who'd threatened legal action to force contact with Elena, who'd hired a lawyer to fight for his rights as a father. Now, faced with actual responsibility, both financial and emotional, he was once again choosing the path that required nothing from him. "Let me understand this correctly," I said, looking directly at Marcus for the first time since we'd entered the courthouse. "You fought for custody rights, claimed you wanted to be Elena's father, threatened legal action if I didn't cooperate. But now that there's a court order requiring you to actually show up and pay support, you want to walk away again?" Marcus had the decency to look uncomfortable, but his resolve didn't waver. "Isabella, it's not that simple. The supervised visitation, it would be confusing for Elena. She doesn't know me. And the financial obligation. I have other responsibilities now." "Other responsibilities?" Of course he did. I later learned through mutual acquaintances that Marcus had gotten engaged 6 months earlier to a woman named Jennifer, a fellow finance professional who shared his ambitions and lifestyle preferences. They were planning a destination wedding in Tuscany, had recently purchased a luxury condo downtown, and were apparently building the kind of life he'd felt Elena and I would prevent him from having. "So your solution is to abandon her again?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "To pay money instead of being a father?" "I'm offering to pay you," he said, his voice taking on the defensive tone I remembered from our final conversations years earlier. $50,000 cash. Right now. Elena's college fund or whatever you want to use it for. In exchange, I sign away all rights, and you agree not to pursue any future support claims. $50,000. It was more money than I'd ever had access to at one time. Enough to ensure Elena's educational future. Enough to provide security I'd been working toward for years. It was also Marcus's way of quantifying his relationship with his daughter, putting a price tag on abandonment, buying his way out of fatherhood like it was a contract he'd decided was no longer beneficial. My lawyer advised me to consider the offer carefully. "It's not just about the money," she explained. "If he signs away his rights completely, Elena gains legal security. No future custody battles, no possibility of him disrupting her life if he changes his mind again. And $50,000 is substantial compensation for 4 years of sole financial responsibility." But accepting the money felt like validation of Marcus's belief that everything could be reduced to financial transactions, that his relationship with Elena was something that could be purchased and dismissed, rather than a fundamental responsibility that came with bringing a child into the world. That night, I sat Elena down for one of the most difficult conversations of my life. At 4 years old, she was old enough to understand basic concepts about families and parents, but explaining why her father had never been part of her life required delicate honesty that wouldn't damage her self-worth. "Elena, sweetheart, you know how some of your friends have daddies who live with them, and some have daddies who live in different houses but still visit?" She nodded solemnly, her dark eyes serious in the way that children's eyes become when they sense important conversations approaching. "Well, your daddy lives far away, and he's not able to be part of our family right now. That doesn't mean anything is wrong with you, or that you're not lovable. It just means that sometimes grown-ups make choices that don't make sense to other people." Elena considered this information with the gravity of someone much older than her years. "Is that why it's just you and me, Mama?" "Yes, baby. It's just you and me. And we're a perfect family just the way we are." She seemed satisfied with this explanation, returning to her coloring book with the resilience that children possess when they feel secure in their primary relationships. Watching her accept our family structure so easily, I realized that Marcus's absence had never been a source of trauma for her, because she'd never experienced his presence as something to miss. The next morning, I called my lawyer and accepted Marcus's offer. Not because I agreed with his logic or approved of his choices, but because Elena deserved the security that his legal abandonment would provide. The $50,000 would go into a college fund, ensuring that his daughter would have educational opportunities, regardless of whatever other responsibilities claimed his attention in the future. The paperwork was finalized within 2 weeks. Marcus signed away all parental rights, agreeing never to contact Elena or attempt to establish any relationship with her. In exchange, I received a cashier's check for $50,000 and the legal certainty that he could never again disrupt our lives with belated claims of paternal interest. I deposited the check into an education savings account in Elena's name, money that would grow over the next 14 years, to provide her with college options that my salary alone could never have afforded. Every statement I received, every dividend payment and interest accrual, served as a reminder that her father had chosen to love her with money rather than presence, to provide for her education while forfeiting any right to know who she would become. Elena thrived in the years that followed. She excelled in school, made friends easily, and developed interests in art and music that I supported with the enthusiasm of someone who understood that childhood opportunities shape adult possibilities. She never asked about her father again after our conversation, seeming to accept that our family structure was simply the way things were meant to be. When Elena turned 10, I finally told her the complete truth about her father. Not the gentle version I'd shared when she was 4, but the real story of how Marcus had chosen his freedom over our family, how he'd abandoned us when things became difficult, and how he'd ultimately paid money to avoid the responsibilities of fatherhood. I expected anger or sadness, but Elena's response surprised me. "So he paid for my college instead of being my dad?" she asked, demonstrating the practical wisdom that children sometimes possess. "Yes," I said. "He decided that money was the only way he could love you." Elena considered this for a long moment. "That's sad for him," she said finally. "He doesn't get to know me, and I'm pretty awesome." The confidence in her voice, the secure sense of self-worth that had developed despite, or perhaps because of, her father's absence, confirmed that we'd built something strong together. Elena knew she was loved completely and unconditionally by the parent who'd chosen to stay, and that knowledge had given her the resilience to view her father's abandonment as his loss, rather than her deficiency. By the time Elena turned 16, she'd grown into a remarkable young woman. She was valedictorian of her sophomore class, captain of the debate team, and had already begun receiving recruitment letters from prestigious universities, thanks to her academic achievements and extracurricular involvement. The college fund that had originated from Marcus's payment had grown substantially, providing her with options that would have been impossible if I'd been solely responsible for saving for her education. It was during her junior year that Elena came to me with a request that both surprised and impressed me. She'd been researching scholarship opportunities and had discovered that her academic achievements qualified her for full rides to several excellent universities. "Mom," she said, sitting across from me at our kitchen table where we'd had so many important conversations over the years, "I want to donate Dad's money to a scholarship fund for single mothers pursuing education." The maturity and thoughtfulness of her proposal took my breath away. At 17, she'd developed the wisdom to transform her father's abandonment into something positive for other families facing similar challenges. "Are you sure?" I asked. "That money could provide you with financial security, graduate school options, or a safety net for unexpected opportunities?" Elena shook her head with the certainty of someone who'd inherited both her parents' stubbornness, but had channeled it toward more constructive purposes than either of us had managed in our youth. "I'm sure. I don't want his money for myself, but I want it to help other kids whose moms are doing what you did, working and going to school and trying to build better lives for their families. That feels like the right way to honor what you sacrificed for me." We established the Elena Rivera Chen Scholarship Fund for single mothers, using Marcus's $50,000 as seed money for awards that would help women pursue educational goals while raising children alone. The first recipient was a nursing student who'd been struggling to balance clinical rotations with single parenthood, and her gratitude letter brought tears to both Elena's and my eyes. Elena graduated as valedictorian and accepted a full scholarship to study international relations at Georgetown University. Watching her deliver her graduation speech about resilience, about the families we choose, about turning difficult circumstances into opportunities for growth, I felt prouder than I'd ever thought possible. She was 18 years old, brilliant and confident, and ready to change the world, and she'd achieved all of it without any contribution from the man who'd claimed she would ruin his life. Marcus had been right about one thing. Having Elena had changed everything, but the changes had been overwhelmingly positive for everyone who'd chosen to embrace them. The scholarship fund continued to grow, supported by donations from people who'd heard Elena's story and wanted to contribute to helping other single-parent families. Elena updated the website from her dorm room, sharing recipients' success stories and recruiting mentors from her university's alumni network. It was during Elena's sophomore year at Georgetown that I received a phone call that brought Marcus's story full circle in ways I couldn't have anticipated. The caller identified himself as David Rivera, Marcus's younger brother, and his voice carried a gravity that made my stomach clench with anxiety. "Ms. Chen, I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from, well, it took some detective work. I wanted to talk to you about Marcus." I hadn't spoken to anyone from Marcus's family since our breakup, and hearing his surname spoken aloud transported me instantly back to those early days when I'd imagined we might someday share that name, when I'd pictured holiday dinners and family gatherings that had never materialized. "What about Marcus?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know whatever news required a phone call from a brother-in-law I'd never met. "He's dying," David said without preamble. "Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctors say he has maybe 6 months." The words hit me like physical blows, not because I still harbored romantic feelings for Marcus, but because Elena's father was dying, and she didn't even know he existed beyond the abstract concept of someone who'd contributed genetic material to her creation. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it, despite everything that had happened between us. That's terrible news." "He wants to see Elena," David continued, "before he dies. He knows he has no rights, knows he gave those up years ago, but he's hoping you might consider letting him meet her, just once." The audacity was breathtaking, even in the face of terminal diagnosis. Marcus had spent 20 years avoiding his daughter, had literally paid money to ensure he'd never have to acknowledge her existence, and now expected me to provide him with access to her, because his circumstances had changed. "David, I appreciate you calling, and I'm genuinely sorry about Marcus's diagnosis, but Elena doesn't know him. As far as she's concerned, she doesn't have a father. Introducing him now, when he's dying, would be traumatic for her and unfair to everyone involved." "I understand," David said, though his voice suggested he'd hoped for a different response. "But could you at least tell her about him? Let her decide if she wants to meet him? She's an adult now, isn't she?" Elena was indeed an adult. 19 years old, sophisticated and thoughtful, certainly capable of making her own decisions about whether to meet the man who'd abandoned her before birth. But she was also my daughter, the child I'd protected and nurtured and prioritized for 2 decades, and I wasn't about to expose her to potential emotional trauma, because Marcus had finally developed a deathbed interest in fatherhood. "I'll think about it," I told David, though I'd already made my decision. Marcus had chosen to be a stranger to Elena, and strangers didn't get to claim emotional connection when convenient circumstances arose. That night, I called Elena at her dorm and told her about David's call. I explained about Marcus's diagnosis, about his request to meet her, about the impossible position his illness had created for our family. Elena listened without interruption, and when I finished, she was quiet for so long that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Elena, are you still there?" "I'm here, Mom. I'm just processing." Her voice was steady, controlled in the way that suggested she was thinking through implications, rather than reacting emotionally. "He's dying, and he wants to meet me?" "Yes, but sweetheart, you don't owe him anything. He made his choices 20 years ago, and those choices have consequences. You don't have to provide him with closure or absolution just because he's running out of time." "I know," Elena said, "and honestly, I don't want to meet him. I don't want to sit in a hospital room with a stranger who happened to contribute DNA to my existence. I don't want to pretend that biology creates obligations that behavior hasn't earned." Her certainty surprised and impressed me. At 19, Elena had developed clear boundaries and strong values that allowed her to resist emotional manipulation, even when that manipulation came wrapped in the tragedy of terminal illness. "But Mom," she continued, "I do want to write him a letter. Not for his sake, but for mine. I want him to know who I became despite his absence, what I've accomplished without his input or support. I want him to understand what he chose to miss." The letter Elena wrote was a masterpiece of controlled anger and quiet dignity. She described her academic achievements, her scholarship fund work, her plans for graduate school and a career in international human rights law. She thanked him for the college money that had become seed funding for helping other single-parent families, and explained how his abandonment had taught her the value of commitment and responsibility. But the final paragraph was the most devastating. "I want you to know that I've had a wonderful life, filled with love and support and opportunities. I've never felt the absence of a father because my mother provided everything I needed and more. Your decision to leave taught me that some people rise to meet challenges while others run from them, and that lesson has served me well in choosing the people I allow into my life. I hope your remaining time brings you peace, but I won't be part of providing that peace. You forfeited that relationship 20 years ago, when you decided your comfort was more important than your child." She signed it simply, Elena Chen, using the surname I'd given her, and dropping the hyphenated Rivera that had appeared on her birth certificate. The gesture was small, but profound, a final severing of the connection Marcus had never chosen to honor. David called a week later to confirm that Marcus had received the letter. He cried when he read it, David said. I think he finally understood what he'd lost. Good, I said, feeling no sympathy for Marcus's belated recognition of his mistakes. Understanding consequences is part of growing up. It's unfortunate that it took him 48 years to learn that lesson. Marcus died 3 months later, alone except for the medical staff and David's family. Elena was in the middle of final exams and didn't request time off to attend his funeral. She sent flowers with a card that read, "For the scholarship recipients who will benefit from your final contribution," and continued with her studies as if nothing significant had occurred. Because for Elena, nothing significant had occurred. The death of a stranger, however biologically connected, couldn't compete with the life she was actively building, the relationships she was nurturing, the future she was creating through her own choices and efforts. The scholarship fund received an unexpected boost when Marcus's estate was settled. Despite having a new wife and stepchildren, he'd apparently left a substantial portion of his assets to Elena, money she immediately donated to expand the scholarship program. The Marcus Rivera Memorial Scholarship for Single Mothers became one of the largest such funds in our state, helping dozens of women pursue educational goals while raising children alone. He was more useful to other families dead than he ever was to ours alive, Elena observed when we received the final estate documentation. Her comment was harsh, but accurate. Marcus's greatest contribution to single motherhood had been his absence, which forced other people to step up and provide what he couldn't or wouldn't offer. Elena graduated summa cum laude from Georgetown and was accepted to Harvard Law School with a full fellowship. At her graduation party, surrounded by friends who'd become her chosen family and professors who'd become her mentors, she gave a toast that brought everyone to tears. "To my mom," she said, raising her glass toward me, "who taught me that families aren't defined by who stays, but by who chooses love over convenience, commitment over comfort, responsibility over self-interest. And to all the single parents out there doing the impossible work of being enough for their children, you are enough, and your children will grow up knowing what real love looks like because they learned it from you." That night, as we cleaned up after the party, Elena handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter she'd written, not to Marcus this time, but to me. "Mom," it read, "I know I don't say this enough, but you gave me everything that mattered. Not just food and shelter and education, but confidence and values, and the security of knowing I was completely loved. Marcus's abandonment could have defined my life in negative ways, but your presence ensured it defined my life positively instead. You showed me what strength looks like, what dedication means, what it takes to build something beautiful out of difficult circumstances. I'm proud to be your daughter, and I hope someday I can love someone the way you loved me, completely, unconditionally, and without reservation." Reading that letter, I understood that the real victory hadn't been the custody battle, or the child support, or even Elena's academic achievements. The real victory had been raising a daughter who understood the difference between love and obligation, between commitment and convenience, between people who showed up and people who merely showed up when it was beneficial to them. Marcus had been right about one thing all those years ago. Having Elena had changed everything. But the changes had made me stronger, not weaker, more focused, not more scattered, more capable of love, not less capable of pursuing my goals. Elena hadn't ruined my life. She'd given it meaning and purpose and joy that I'd never known were possible. Now, as I write this story, Elena is in her second year at Harvard Law School, specializing in family law, with a focus on protecting children's rights in custody disputes. The scholarship fund has helped over 200 single mothers complete their education, and Elena continues to serve on its board while maintaining perfect grades and working part-time at a legal aid clinic. She's dating a fellow law student named James, who understands that Elena comes with a fierce loyalty to her mother and a zero-tolerance policy for people who don't honor their commitments. When he asked her recently what she'd learned from growing up with a single mother, she told him, "I learned that some people are worth waiting for, and some people aren't worth the time it takes to miss them." Marcus thought he was protecting his freedom when he walked away from us. Instead, he forfeited the chance to know the most remarkable person either of us would ever encounter. He chose comfort over complexity, convenience over commitment, and in doing so, he lost access to a love that could have transformed him into someone worth knowing. Elena and I built a life together that was richer, stronger, and more meaningful than anything Marcus could have imagined when he decided we weren't worth his time. We proved that families are defined by choice rather than biology, by presence rather than promises, by the daily decision to show up and love completely, even when circumstances are difficult. The custody papers that granted me sole legal rights to Elena were just pieces of paper. The real victory was raising a daughter who knew her worth, understood her power, and would never accept less than complete love from the people she allowed into her life. Marcus's abandonment taught Elena what she didn't want in a partner, and my presence taught her what she deserved. That's the kind of victory that lasts generations, not the satisfaction of legal documents or financial settlements, but the knowledge that you raised someone who will break cycles instead of perpetuating them, who will choose love over fear, who will build rather than abandon when life becomes challenging. In the end, Marcus got exactly what he wanted, a life free from the complications of fatherhood. And Elena and I got exactly what we deserved, a life full of love, achievement, and the unshakable bond between two people who chose each other every single day for 22 years.